So on a slightly smaller panel, I've got Belinda Robertson, who is the CEO of Universities Australia, Craig Robertson, who's the CEO of TAFE Directors Australia, which is in, the TAFEs are in both higher education and vocational education these days, stressing this. And Simon Finn, who is from the Council of Private Higher Education, the newest member to the higher education peak bodies group, but someone who's been learning a lot about the complexities of TEQSA and other parts of the higher ed system. Now, we saw from Nick Saunders' presentation this morning that the different types of higher education provider are experiencing TEQSA and the standards quite differently. That the high-risk institutions, as classified by TEQSA, are generally in the non-university higher education sector. And similarly, when you look at the satisfaction levels with TEQSA, that most of the grievances with TEQSA are coming from this non-university sector. And I think it's important to have sort of the range of views on this panel. I want to start with Belinda. So even though universities seem to be fairly satisfied now, it's fair to say that TEQSA had a rocky start with the universities, that there was a perception that it was demanding too much of the universities and inquiring more than it should have. Are universities generally happy with the way TEQSA and the whole standards framework is going now?
Look, I think you're right. And this universities, the large low-risk providers are generally, really see TEQSA as critically important, actually, to maintaining the reputation of higher education in Australia. And I should point out too that universities strongly supported TEQSA right from its inception, and in fact were quite involved in the development of some of the legislation underpinning TEQSA. And as part of that process, some in the room might not be aware, but they were very keen to ensure that the legislation was, I guess, anchored in some key principles. And there are three key principles in the legislation around risk, necessity, and proportionality. And I think in the early days, you're right, Andrew, it got off to a very rocky start. I'd say well, yes, it was because of the level of information that was required. And a survey, anyone who was involved in this, the survey of third-party providers was, I think, the thing that really had the hairs on the back of the necks of Vice-Chancellors stand up. But it was more around there wasn't a sense that those guiding principles were being adhered to. And so what the providers felt was, in the absence of there being a real risk approach or looking at risk and developing a risk framework, what we saw was TEQSA, I guess, sinking to the lowest common denominator. In other words, they were seeing the same requirements being put out to all providers regardless of the level of risk. But certainly what we're seeing now, and I would encapsulate the general view of the university sector, is a real sense that the legislation, the application of the legislation and the way that TEQSA is conducting itself is really now we feel really is being driven by those three governing principles that are so important. I think we're seeing that in the feedback, the stakeholder feedback that we're getting.
Can I move on to the other panel members? Now, I think we all realise there have been some, but not huge numbers of issues in the non-university sector. For example, do the providers who see themselves as relatively high quality experience this in the same way as the universities, or do they feel like they're being put in a group that's regarded as all very high risk? Something you, Simon?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Look, I think it's fair to say that the private providers perhaps have a different view about TEQSA's role and activities, and I'll come to some more general points. I do want to just say though, similar to universities, COFI supported the development of TEQSA as a single national regulator, values the equality that model is designed to to implement that regardless of the nature of provider, you're subject to the same quality standards. Kofi's supportive of those, and my members are supportive of those. I guess we have a few issues in relation to, there's a perception in the private providers that a lot of the regulatory activity is focused in that small 10% of the sector, that despite it being 10% of the sector, it does represent a large number of students. But there's a perception that a lot of the regulatory activity is focused there. And we saw this morning the presentation from Nick, where we saw risk framework slides for the private providers and but not one up for the universities. We see a lot of focus coming from TEXA about that regulatory activity too. Now, it may well be that the nature of private providers creates that different scenario as well. I don't think it's necessarily valuable to talk through, the range of issues that individual providers have, except I think in the room, private providers would say that they experience long time frames for decision making to get outcomes from TEXA in re-registration or re-accreditation processes, or even initial. We don't represent people who aren't yet registered providers, but I suspect it's similar for initial applications. There seems to be significant reporting back to us about staffing issues coming from our providers and indeed from TEXA themselves. But if I could just say where I think there's a couple of areas that we can work on. My perception is that the regulatory approach of partnership has declined a little over in recent years. That partnership model for us is that a regulatory action should be as much about, or the need to take regulatory action should be as much about a failure of a partnership model as it is about failure of provider. So the role of the regulator in assisting and supporting providers, we think, has declined a little. We've seen anecdotal reports of increased disputation reaching the tribunal, and I think that whilst I haven't seen published stats around that, we would have a concern that if there are more and more matters reaching higher and higher levels of disputation, then that sense of a failure of a partnership model. Finally, though, I think that we need to be realistic about the longevity of TEXA. TEXA is a relatively young regulator. It's been around since 2011. We're only in 2017. It's designed to create a national discipline, and I think there's still a bit of time to come before that works its way out. If we drill down a little bit more, established under a Labor government in 2011 that had a macro picture and was a government of harmonisation models, and then a change of government 2 years into its life, a period of time where it sort of struggled to work out what this government thought of it. Then we had the Christopher Pyne crash through or crash model, which created a bit more uncertainty in the sector, and now we have where we are today. And yet, in all of that, when I started in this role at the beginning of this year, the first meeting I went to was with PwC, where the topic of discussion was how do we increase the cost recovery model of TEXA. So my view of this is that TEXA needs to be adequately funded. Government needs to see it as funding it for a long period of time, enabling it to develop a national discipline that is more transparent and better understood across the sector.
Great. Yeah. We've got about 10 of our TAFEs that are new HEPs. And to be honest, I'm reasonably new to the wonderful world of higher education regulation and quality assurance, but I don't hear much negative feedback. And in fact, where we think we want to go forward, because we're always going to jump from where is the vet sector in the context of the tertiary education sector, is I think the strength within TEXA are the standards that can help
institutions develop their academic processes and academic rigour. And so we would really want to be able to say that should be a model that spreads right across the TAFE sector, both for their role in vocational education and in the higher education that they deliver. But I think the other thing we need to bear in mind is if we were true to the Bradley proposal, there would be reasonably open access to public funding and subsidy, and in some ways there'd be a bit of a merge going on, or some sort of coordinated approach to regulation across the two sectors. And we're clearly not there, and I think there's some work that we need to do on that front.
So that really, in the title of this organisation, Tertiary, there's an implicit idea that it will in fact cover general post-school education rather than just higher education as it is at the moment. So what are the panel's general views on sort of moving towards a system that's unified in both regulation and funding, in the way that we've got in some other countries?
Well, when TEXA was initially established, many people might remember that the government actually did suggest, or in fact committed to, the broadening of TEXA to incorporate the entire tertiary education system. Look, from a Universities Australia and a whole university sector, I don't think there is a common or a particular view on that, but they are two very different systems. And I think when people started to look into the ability to be able to do that, some of the differences between the sectors made it appear a little more that it was going to be an effort and a job that was going to be more complicated perhaps than people thought. So I think in principle it sounds like a good idea, and the more seamlessness we can build into tertiary education more broadly, the better. And again, on the face of it, if we can do that through the regulation of the system, then that should have benefits for achieving that seamlessness. But they are different systems, and it will take, I think, a little bit of work and some really serious thinking and consultation to enable that to occur.
Yeah, we've thought about that a bit. Let's think about it in terms of a merger or an acquisition perspective. Who's the bigger regulator, ASQA or TEXA? Let me say that it would be ASQA. So let's now think through that it's ASQA that comes in, and this could potentially be the consequence. And I'm not having a go at ASQA here, but they would define and come in and tell you whether you're teaching the right thing or not and define your qualifications, because that'd be done by a centralised committee. They would come through and prescribe and check all of your teaching facilities, etc., etc. And so it would be a completely different model, and I hope you would realise that I don't think any public policy officer would be recommending that. But I do think the way that we start to solve it, and I do come back a bit to the Bradley proposition, because I think that was saying, let's think about a combined regulation on the ISCED scale, primarily. I can't remember the particular things, but you would then go to a tertiary education model, and I do think there are some ways that could be sorted. I'm now going to throw a bit of a rock at the vet sector. Don't assume that vet is tertiary, and this is part of our problem when we come to talk about the tertiary education sector. What we've got confused about in Australia is that we think everything that industry demands is vet, and therefore that's what we should be doing. What we should be doing is saying there's vocational education, which has a different set of purposes and mission, and I think that fits in quite suitably into a TEXA, into a tertiary model. Now let's think about training. A lot of the training and qualifications we do is about servicing the needs of industry. Now that's a public policy benefit because hopefully it smooths the way for a person to get to a job, but let's not get caught up in saying that's education as well. And so I think VET would have to look at itself to say, well, how should it be structured to be able to come into a tertiary world? So,
yeah. It's probably not a question that we've given too much consideration to. I probably had a neutral view. Now I probably have a strong view given what Craig just said. much stronger view. But look, I think it's about relationships between the regulators, and maybe it's a longer term view about there being one regulator. But we're clearly seeing a greater emphasis in higher education on employment outcomes. It's been referred to, I think, by your good self as the vetification of higher education, Andrew. So I think there needs to be a greater synergy between the two, and whether a single regulator into the future is the way to go, I think will evolve.
So one other area of fairly new overlap is in the way the department is moving back into the quality space. So earlier this year, there was something called the Provider Integrity legislation passed, which was essentially aimed at trying to avoid the vet fee help problems occurring in higher education. And this is in the context of quite a few RTOs trying to get into higher education through TEXA. What the Provider Integrity legislation does, though, is it doesn't really use a TEXA-style risk-based approach. It just classifies all non-universities as high risk. And it's starting to do things which are really traditionally TEXAs. For example, there's a new statutory provision. You have to assess the academic suitability of your student at the unit of study level. And so it's not quite clear to what extent this is the same as sort of the admission and progression requirements that TEXA already does, and to what extent it's different. And to the extent that it is essentially the same, why are two organisations in the same regulatory structure doing the same thing? Might start with the non-university people, but I'd like to hear Belinda's view on this as well.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. We had some deep concerns about this legislation around a few areas, but primarily because it was a government response to the vet fee help issue. We had, and in fairness to government, there was some indication that some of those vet providers were going to now look at higher education as, vets got too hard for us to operate in. What are our opportunities in higher education? And that was the normal response from a minister would be to say, make sure we stop it happening in higher education. And a reasonable approach, and one that we support. However, the process became, let's grab the vet legislation and mirror it into higher education. And without there being some sort of recognition that the problems that were faced in the vet sector weren't prevalent in higher education, that there had not been a case of higher education providers displacing students in the same way, nor exploitation, whether it was misuse or not, but exploitation of the help schemes either. So we had some concerns with that, that there needed to be a better dialogue and perhaps some better thought into how that legislation was developed to achieve much the same aims. But and I think I should just say this: like, I felt that the debate around that legislation was virtually non-existent, but where it was existent, struck a low point in discourse. In that, you were seen, if you opposed the legislation, to therefore be supporting what the government termed as shonks. So I think it was Mark who went out, made some public comment, and the minister's response was, anybody who supports this is supporting shonks. I think that's a real low point in discourse. I think that signified the intention of the legislation rather than that we want to have a proper dialogue around its purpose. Also, when it went through the Parliament, there was 4 speakers in the lower house, I think a couple in the Senate, one speech in opposition. The speech in the lower house, of course, was an opportunity for, which it always is in Parliament, is an opportunity for representatives to speak about whatever's on their mind rather than the bill at hand. So it was used by a number of MPs to talk about the other piece of legislation around the budget rather than the detail of the actual act. So I think it was misunderstood. Coming back to your question very quickly, we think that there is a concern in this legislation around the department enlivening a quality regime within the department that fits properly in the role of TEXA. Academic suitability is work that is done by providers at the entry level of students, regulated appropriately through course accreditation of TEXA. We think that there's a place to rely on. There's a regulator that can provide the department with information as needed. Finally though, let me just say, Andrew, the thing that interests me in this bill is that there is academic progress rules for providers that don't apply to students of universities. So the bill only applies to other providers as categorised under HESA. And it also provides protection for students from marketing and cold calling practices. And I wonder whether those protections, why a student in the public sector wouldn't be afforded the same sort of protections.
It's quite instructive to watch the February Senate estimates. I don't know whether you can replay it these days, but there was this visible sense of relief from the minister and from the coalition senators who were at the table saying, thank goodness we've got that in just in time to stop these marauding vet providers coming in. Now, and so, you know, I guess good luck to protect the higher education sector. Our view is they've been prepared to trash the vet sector as a result. And this is a real issue that we've got in Australia. But I think that going really to your point, it's like we really haven't learnt our lesson because one of the reasons why vet fee help got out of control is everybody was saying, no, it's ASQA. No, they were saying, no, it's the department. No, it should be this. And they just walked all the way through. I've just finished a stint down here in Victoria, sort of following the Victorian Training Guarantee, and let me tell you, it's much the same sort of thing. We'll put in a liberalised funding system because they've got all these backup of national regulatory arrangements and quality arrangements. And so what happened? No, it's them, it's them, it's them. And we run the risk of doing that again, and they'll just walk their way through it. And we've got to keep an eye out in public policy terms, because guess what's the next big thing of government that's got that sort of model is NDIS. And let me tell you, if you think that these things are of the past, they're not. It'll come.
And look, to the broader point around maintaining the integrity of a regulatory system, we have to be clear, and the public has to be clear and have assurance and confidence that there is clarity over roles and responsibilities. I think there are very real dangers of the department moving into a regulatory role because then it starts to confuse, I guess, the difference between policy-making responsibility and authority and regulatory authority. Good regulation doesn't confuse those two roles, and the department, of course, is answerable to the minister. They're essentially a policy-making organisation answerable to the minister. It's critically important that in maintaining the integrity of regulation that there is and is seen to be distance between policymakers, between government and the regulatory authority, and that independence is not only perceived but is in fact delivering the sort of integrity around regulation that's absolutely critical. I do think there is a danger here. I think we are starting to see some regulatory action being taken by the department, and I think we have to be very, very careful about that.
So what is the role of the department here? I'm assuming, going on from the last session, there is a legitimate interest in managing risk around help, but do we need new risk indicators that are purely around the loan scheme rather than academic matters more broadly? I can imagine there could be rapid increases in lending and things like that that should be red flags, but I mean you don't have to scrutinise every provider.
Yeah, look, I think that
No
you
views?
can't say no that there doesn't need to
No,
be a
that's right.
regime around this. Of course there does, but I think there needs to just be a clear definition of responsibilities, I think.
I've had cause to go back and look at Kwong Li Dow and Valerie Braithwaite's TEXA review, what was that, 2 or 3 years ago, and it's a little while ago that I did it, but their opening description actually provided a pretty good roadmap for how to try to think about this. You can't regulate without regard to what's going on in the funding regime, because that's a different set of incentives that are playing on. And whilst I can't recall what their structural recommendation were, I think there's a set of principles there that we could look at. And I think particularly where we need to try to get to when we think about where the tertiary sector's going, increasingly globally competitive, and this applies to both regulators, I think it would be really good that it was a continuous improvement supportive role as well, because what we've sort of lost is how can we learn off each other and continually improve. Now, if we've reasonably satisfied that we put the right barriers in place and all that sort of stuff, it would be really good. A, would be really good, but B, it's getting increasingly critical that we try to put that sort of philosophy into place through both of our regulators.
And from a regulator is no different to any other organisation in that most organisations will be continually assessing and evolving their risk register. They'll be looking at risk all the time, as they should. And when you're looking at quality, when you're assuring quality, clearly paying close attention to risk, evolving risks, emerging risks is absolutely a legitimate and critical part of that regulatory function.
Got some questions starting to come up. I'll ask one more question, pursuing my interest in who does what, and then we'll look at the questions from the audience. So this is around the Higher Education Standards Panel, which now seems to have quite a broad-ranging role, looking at, can report out on attrition like TEXA does, and as Grattan will shortly. Looking at admissions transparency, it's got an interesting report out on the role of professional accreditation bodies. In some ways it seems to be doing sort of what TEXA's quality role originally was going to be. Do you think this is a good role for the panel, or is this stuff that should be done elsewhere?
I mean, part of the answer to that is what would the alternative be? And the obvious alternative would be the department. But with the standards panel, we have people who understand how the providers work. So from my perspective, I think of the alternatives, or thinking about this is work. If government wants this work done, someone will do it. They will have to ask someone to do it. So the question really is who is best placed to do it, who has the best expertise, the most appropriate expertise to enable them to do it. And I guess from my view, it is the standards panel, and I think they've actually been doing some really excellent work in this area, because I don't really see that there's an alternative, and I'm not sure that we're in a position to be able to suggest that there should be some new body established, when in fact we have a pretty effective platform already established.
My sense is we've just got to get over this period, because I just think what's gone on is we've grabbed initiatives and the like to try to respond to a variety of things, including the vet providers getting into the higher education sector and the like. We would never want to try to cut off or diminish input, such as through the higher ed standards panel and the like. That would be the kiss of death for new ideas and innovation and the like. My sense about what's required is there needs to be an architect and a vision for a tertiary sector going forward, and that's clearly the role of the government, and then how they then play the parts out can be used different. They can use different agencies and mechanisms to do that.
I think that there's a role for the Higher Education Standards Panel currently. One of my concerns is that TEXA does not morph into this arm of government that is about focusing heavily on its publications of responses to government policy agenda items. Until we've got the core business of regulating locked down, and that that for me is where the space TEXA needs to be in. I think there is value in a HESP being that link between regulator and government. I think there is some value in that. But I see that HESP needs to probably have a sunset clause on it, and its role be picked up by the regulator down the track.
I might move to some of the questions that are being submitted, so please feel free to put more submissions through the system. I'm going to slightly paraphrase the first question, which is really going to whether TEXA or really the original standards are working from a mental model of a public university. And I think probably the rules from which the standards are derived were essentially codifying good practice in the public university system. So I think there is an interesting issue as to what extent, have they adapted so they're really thinking about a very broad higher education system with many different types of provider. Are there any views on this?
I guess I'd just challenge the point that whoever asked the question was that TEXA's operating from a mental model of the operation of a public university, because in fact some of the public universities are a little concerned around the increasing move to turn what are guidance notes and case studies of best practice into prescriptive requirements. And we're starting to get a little bit nervous about that. There's certainly a role for TEXA in providing resources and providing resources for all providers to access around good practice against a whole range of different standards and operations. But we have to be very cautious that we don't allow TEXA to overreach and turn those into prescriptive requirements. And the reason I say that is that, we are, and getting to this broader point about the changing nature of work, the evolution of providers in having to be more innovative in the way they deliver their programs, we need to have a regulator that keeps on top of that innovation, supports that innovation, and doesn't perhaps unconsciously start to anaesthetise that innovation. So I'm not sure that they are applying a mental model for just using public universities as the example here, because public universities are also concerned about some trends that they're starting to see.
I'm not overly well placed to make a comment apart from saying the standards that are embedded in the higher education standards and the like are something that are useful and should be applied and thought through within the TAFE world. Here's my proposition for you. The government at the moment is considering changes to the ASQA regulatory model. What they should be saying is if you're a new HEP regulated by TEXA, you don't need to be regulated by ASQA. Is there media here?
Too late.
Thank you. Andrew, in response to that, in terms of TEXA and its capacity to understand the different models, whilst we support there being a single national standards framework, there is a real issue over scale and capacity between the providers. So there's a different application to smaller providers. Universities with a significant staffing capacity to respond to TEXA requests and requirements do that in a different kind of way than the smaller providers. So perhaps there's a bit of work to be done there. But I just draw you to the stats that were put up in the report this morning in relation to the TEXA survey, and this probably gives some indication of the answer. So if we look at the for-profit providers, the question of how they rank TEXA in terms of actions proportionate to risk, it's down to 24% that say that's good or excellent. So that's the perception in that group of providers. If we keep looking at them, what percentage rate TEXA's engagement with them as good or excellent? We're at 36%. And when asked the question, does TEXA know about your institution, 32% said good or excellent. So there's a category of provider that sort of answers that question.
I'm going to merge a number of questions here. There's a couple about international students and how they fit into this whole framework, and then whether Texas risk framework looks at the right things. And perhaps let's combine those. So we've got a very important and large group in the international students. Are there any special risks around the international students that maybe should be monitored, in addition to the existing risk indicators? Or should we not look at that level of detail? Do we think we have an issue with international students regulation?
I mean, there's been a lot of work done, of course, through the ESOS review. So we've got two frameworks. We've got the TEXA framework, and we also have the ESOS legislation, which is all around protecting international students. And in fact, the problem we had a few years ago was that we did have these two separate frameworks which were not seamless in their operation, and the timing for assessments and so on were out of whack. And we've actually now seen some really good movement and some really good developments in terms of a more consistent approach across Texas and accreditation of the ESOS obligations being done by TEXA. So look, I actually think we've got a really good regime, and in fact we see people from TEXA and other areas of government travelling around the world talking about the quality assurance framework and regime that we have in Australia for higher education, and that's actually something that gives great confidence to international students and their families around the quality that they can reasonably expect when they come to an Australian institution.
Yeah, I've got nothing further to add, really.
Yeah, I tend to agree as well, but I think that it's often spoken about how international education is worth $28 billion to the national economy. Where there probably is a gap is international students' feedback into governance at the institutional level, and it'd be my view that more work needs to be done on that across the sector.
We've got a question about tuition assurance arrangements. I realise this is a complex point. So maybe one of the panel just explain what the issue is without necessarily going on
for the next half hour.
Next half hour, yes.
Okay, so TAFE Directors Australia, as well as ACPET, offered a tuition assurance scheme where you have to, if you're a non-university provider or a vet provider, you have to be a member of that scheme. It offers assurances to students to go to another provider in case of closure. We've all heard about some of the spectacular closures out of vet fee help. We had one which was Careers Australia, 7,000 students, etc., etc. The nature of the debate or disagreement has been when you go back and actually look at the legislation, the guidance, etc., etc., there was a set of obligations between the student and the provider, and that frames the set of obligations and responsibilities of the provider. Now, what we're being asked to do is, if the department's records are not complete, then we're responsible for covering all of those students, whereas we've got separate evidence to say they've completed or they've fulfilled, the providers fulfilled their delivery. So what was at some point, here it is, this is millions and millions of dollars that you're going to have to repay the taxpayer, in our view is close to zero, because we're reading the legislation in a pretty, what we think is a robust way. And so what's happened is the government has said, because of all this dilemma, we'll run the tuition assurance scheme for 2018 and then think about what will be the model for 2019. That's a pretty important thing to get right in 2018, because on the one hand you could say, okay, that's great, the government's going to come in and do that, but hang on a tick, they're the ones who oversighted basically $1.2 billion out the door without any compliance. So what gives you any sense of assurance that they're going to be able to then run a tuition assurance scheme to protect students? that's the nature of the issue that we've got to try to think through getting ready for 2019. And so just to finish off, I want to be very, very clear that TDA has fulfilled all of its obligations and then some. And so for the government to be coming out and saying we're trying to renege on our responsibilities, as I've been reported in the paper, they can test that with me in court.
Okay. I've got a couple of... Tom?
No,
I think you probably...
I think the answer to that question should hang on that final statement.
Is John Ross here? Because I'm really worried about that statement. One more question? One more question. Question about students and maybe what time horizons do the peak bodies have? Are you thinking about, student futures, what the labour market is going to do over the coming decades, and doing any organisation level work about that could inform all your members as to what the trends are? Or is that outside the scope of what the peak bodies do?
I absolutely don't think it's outside the scope of what peak bodies do. And we, the university sector, has a very strong focus and thinking all the time around the changing nature of work and what that means for universities in positioning Australia to make a successful transition to the gig economy. Because for universities, it's immensely important. The changing industrial structure, the changing economic structure is incredibly important for a bunch of reasons. One of them, of course, is because it's from the research programs in universities. It's from those programs that often you see the innovation, the new products, the new industries that are going to underpin the economy to come. But of course, it's also the universities who will be producing the graduates that are going to be needed to not just create new jobs, but also to fill the jobs of the future. What are the skills they're going to need? What's the differences in the sorts of skills they're getting now to the skills that they might need in the future? And of course, it's right across the tertiary education sector where we have to look to ensure that rather than people being fearful of the future, that they can play a really active role in bringing the community along to provide the narrative that no one should be left behind as we make this transition to a different future. And we need to be thinking about how we can deliver, and universities are certainly thinking about it, and I know the rest of the sector is as well, thinking about what do we need to do differently so that everyone has a place in whatever that new economy holds.
Look, very much so. We're looking at it seriously to the extent that 2 weeks ago I put out a call to establish a vet coalition of education leaders to actually come forward and say this is how, in the vet area, this is how our qualification systems need to change. And it's been interesting, the response that I've had on that. Of course, it's not just a vet thing, it's about how, because automation can quickly undo sectoral differences and all of that sort of stuff, so that's important. I would take you to a couple of OECD reports that talk about the basic skill capacity of our workforce, that we've really got a job to do to be able to make sure all workers in the economy have a chance to participate in the AI revolution as it will impact workplaces.
Absolutely, it's important for our part of the sector. If you're a provider that is a not-for-profit or a for-profit or not eligible for fee help provider, you're relying on student fees. You're finely attuned to the market in relation to student outcomes. It's always been a critical issue for my part of the sector, if I can call it mine, but the sector I represent. And we've commenced a body of work this year in benchmarking industry connections. So it is a role for peak bodies to foster that within their member institutions.
It's a very positive note on which to end our session. So I'd like to thank Belinda, Craig and Simon.
Thank you.